Hello there, my name is Philip Allen, and I'll be having the pleasure of standing here and talking to you all about comics. But before that, cue the music. Man, I've always wanted to say that. Well, as I mentioned before, I'm here to talk to you all about comics. In this episode, I'll be discussing a particular question. How do comic creators, these guys, tell stories with comics? Before I begin, I'd like to thank Ramazan Romain for providing some sample panels from the second issue of his comic, Flowing Blade Bushido. With his examples, I hope to better explain the topic that I plan on covering today. Now, let's get started. Comics are a very unique literary medium. Books, for instance, can include images, maybe even illustrations, but they, more often than not, don't depend on them to share their stories or ideas. Film and television depend heavily on both visuals and sound to tell stories and share ideas. What makes comics different from film, television, and books is that they require the reader to interpret and understand a story that is told not only inside of a panel, but between them. So, the next question to address is this. What types of stories or ideas can comic creators express within and between panels? In this episode, I'll be referencing Scott McCloud, a renowned comic creator and the writer of the book Understanding Comics. In his book, he went on to explain his research as well as, his understanding of how comics work as a literary medium. Fun fact, his book is not only one of the few resources out there that focuses on comics, but it's also the first book I've ever found that helped me better understand comics as a medium. In this book, which is written like a comic by the way, there is a section that goes on to explain that there are 6 different types of panel-to-panel transition types that a comic creator can use to tell stories with. These are moment-to-moment, action-to-action, subject-to-subject, scene-to-scene, aspect-to-aspect, and non-sequitur. Each of these panel-to-panel transition types requires something from the reader, an ability to interpret and understand the message intended by the comic creator. Maybe I'll spend some time in another episode talking about how comic creators can limit any misunderstandings and misreadings of their work. But let me get back on topic. Let's begin with the moment-to-moment, panel-to-panel transition. This panel-to-panel transition type illustrates a small change occurring between 2 panels. This panel-to-panel transition type provides an almost cinematic reading experience. It emphasizes a particular action taking place. Take a look at these sample panels from the second issue of Flowing Blade Bushido. In the first panel, you are shown a character seemingly drowning. In the next one, you see him still drowning while he's being called out to awaken. The second panel shows a similar image, but it's zoomed in. Illustrating the second panel like this is meant to emulate the same effect of a camera zooming in on an object. Illustrating these panels like this draws emphasis to the character's drowning, the danger that he's still in, all the while also drawing emphasis to the voice calling out to him. As you can see from the sample panels, this type of panel-to-panel transition typically doesn't require very much experience to interpret the idea or story being told between these panels. When using this type of panel-to-panel transition, the reader is often kept inside the same scene, and both panels could be presented using the same perspective. The action-to-action panel-to-panel transition type illustrates 2 panels where an object, this can be either a character or a thing, progressing through an action. Man, that's a lot of action. This is different than the moment-to-moment panel transition type because the action in question isn't being illustrated little by little. In this case, the comic creator is expecting that the reader is able to fill in the blanks of what happens between panel 1 and panel 2. This panel-to-panel transition type can end up saving an illustrator tons of time, not to mention page space. Illustrating a single action being depicted by an object over multiple panels can take up a lot of real estate. Take a look at this example. In the first panel, you can see 2 characters swimming towards something. The second panel illustrates them resurfacing from the water. Instead of being treated to these characters slowly approaching the surface over a number of panels, we're instead given 2 panels and expected to read them as if the characters realized they were underwater and they needed to resurface, and then did. Pretty direct. As you can see from this example, using the action-to-action panel-to-panel transition type requires a very little amount of experience and engagement from the reader to interpret the story and message being told between these panels. Similarly to the moment-to-moment transition type, the reader is often kept within the same scene, although the perspective views may change between panels. The subject-to-subject panel-to-panel transition type requires a little more interpretation from the reader to understand the story or idea being presented. Are you starting to see a little trend here? This transition type will often still keep the reader in the same scene, Both panels can show different actions being portrayed by different objects in the same scene, but they are related to one another. Most often, the action or actions illustrated in the first panel are the cause of the action or reactions of the objects in the second one. As you may have noticed, the further down we go on this list of panel-to-panel transition types, the more is required from the reader to understand the comic creator's message. Take a look at these sample panels. In the first panel, you see an armored samurai, seemingly swinging a weapon downward. The second panel illustrates a crashing blow that cracks the earth. You, as the reader, are expected to interpret that the armored samurai in the first panel swung their weapon, which led to a very literal crashing blow. The subject-to-subject panel-to-panel transition type can give the reader a sense of fast-paced action. A lot may be occurring outside of the reader's view when using this form of transition. The scene-to-scene panel-to-panel transition type is used by comic creators to send their readers across significant distance of either time, space, or both. Funny enough, this type of panel-to-panel transition type is more often used as, well, a transition between scenes. In one moment, you're in one place, and in the next, you are in another. To not make the experience too jarring, a comic creator will often use dialogue or some other form of content from the first panel to make clear where the story will be leading the reader. Sometimes, dialogue from one scene will be split between two panels, making connection between the two scenes. For instance, check out these sample panels. These two panels illustrate two very different scenes. The first one, you see a flying object being observed by two characters. The next panel depicts a scene that distinctly appears different than the previous one. When using this type of panel-to-panel transition type, a comic creator has to be careful. You could be losing your reader if not properly writing or illustrating the transition between scenes. The scene-to-scene panel transition type forces the story to change its scene. This gives a comic reader the opportunity to bring a conclusion, maybe a temporary one, to the events occurring in the first panel. This can help to push the story forward, controlling the pacing of the story, or it can save the writer and illustrator from having to present any boring travels that the characters or objects from the first scene may traverse. As we get closer to the end, we reach the aspect-to-aspect panel-to-panel transition type. This one's a fun one. This transition type can quite often disregard any concept of time and space when trying to tell a story. Instead, it is often used to give a wandering eye experience. This panel-to-panel transition type gives the reader an opportunity to get a feel for the place, idea, or mood that is presented by the comic creator. Picture a series or a collage of panels detailing the scenes or events occurring on a beach. The rising sun, the waves, people playing volleyball, that sort of thing. Take a look at these sample panels. They are not as cheerful as the ones that I just made you picture. Throughout these three panels, which are all presented on one page, you're presented with scenes of planet in ruins, buildings collapsed, wildlife obliterated. These panels are used to present a place that is no more. The dialogue box narrates the tale being told, but it's the images that allows the reader to truly understand the consequences. This type of panel-to-panel transition type breaks away from the usual type of story or idea that you often find being expressed from the other panel transition types. This can end up jarring a reader out of the story. Depending on their experience and choice in comic reading material, they may not be able to grasp the type of story or idea that you're trying to share. Providing a reader context before, during, or after presenting these panel transitions can help you not to lose your reader. Fun fact, this panel-to-panel transition type is rarely seen in Western comics. This type of transition is actually frequently found in manga. I'd like to think that more comic readers today, including those in the West, have at least been introduced to manga and their various literary and illustrated traditions to be able to grasp the idea that a comic creator is just trying to set a mood without necessarily trying to push a story forward. When depicting an aspect-to-aspect panel-to-panel transition, you may or may not be kept on the same scene. As I mentioned before, the story or idea being presented within and between these panels allows the comic creator to give the readers a wandering perspective of a place, idea, or mood. It can also play a lot like a montage in a movie or television show. Don't restrict yourself. And last, but certainly not least, we have the non-sequitur panel-to-panel transition. Simply put, this panel transition refers to any two panels next to each other that have absolutely no meaning, story, or idea meant to be conveyed by the comic creator to the reader. Take these two panels as an example. These were illustrated by me, so have mercy. In the first panel, you'll see an illustration of a screw, the second an illustration of a teddy bear. I can tell you right now that there is no hidden or explicit meaning between these two panels. They are just illustrations of two separate objects. No idea or story was intended to be extrapolated from reading them as a comic. This is probably what makes this the weirdest panel-to-panel transition type that I will be describing in this video. Just think about that. By definition, no story is being told between and maybe even within these panels. But that's where the funny part comes in. We, as humans, have a tendency to see patterns or create meaning when there are no intended patterns or meaning. It's quite fascinating, actually. Some would say that for comic readers, this type of panel-to-panel transition type requires the most of their engagement to understand the story and idea that is illustrated within and between these two panels, even if it means that they end up telling themselves a new and unintended story. By any means, a comic creator could be breaking apart the story at this point, keeping the reader within the same, separate, or non-existent scenes. I know it's weird, but that's kind of the point here. And there you have it. 6 different ways that comic creators can tell stories between panels. When I learned about these, it blew me away at just how straightforward the whole concept was. I would strongly recommend that you check out Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, and a couple other books that he has written that specifically study and explain comics. I'll be leaving the links to those in the description below. If you like the sample panels that I used in this episode, once again, they were kindly provided by Razan Romain and illustrated by his artist Fun King Chu, I hope I pronounced that right, for the second issue of his comic Flowing Blade Bushido. I'd strongly recommend you check out his first issue. Also, Razan is not only a comic creator, but he's also the founder of the publishing house Prismatic Press. If you're looking for a publisher to help make your dreams of becoming a published comic creator, I recommend you check out his submission guide. If you do end up sending something to him, let him know that Philip Allen from Unknown Comics sent you. I will be leaving links to all that in the description below. So how about some end of video questions? What did you think about Scott McCloud's theory of the 6 different panel-to-panel transition types? What do you think are some of the complications that comics, as a medium, have to deal with to reduce any misunderstandings when telling stories? Do you think that you could be using some of the terms covered in this video and adding them to your professional vocabulary when communicating with collaborators? If you have, has it helped so far? Do you think that publishers should encourage new creators to become familiar with industry standard reading material like Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics to encourage a common vocabulary? Let me know your thoughts and answers in the comment section below. Now, thank you all for joining me for my first episode. I hope to be doing this for many years to come. My goal for this year is to release 10 episodes, but my goal for this episode is to get over 200 likes and 20 subscriptions by the end of my next episode. Let's make that a reality together. I look forward to seeing you all in my next 9 episodes. See you next time.